As the First World War entered its final year, the world teetered on a precipice of exhaustion, a fragile equilibrium stretched thin by 4 years of unprecedented conflict. Soldiers in Europe's trenches had already become accustomed to a daily rhythm of mud, blood, and shell fire, their bodies and minds pushed beyond the limits of endurance. Cities on the home front were crowded with refugees, workers conscripted into war industries, and families struggling to maintain some semblance of normalcy amid rationing, air raids, and the relentless anxiety of absent fathers and brothers. Across oceans, nations had mobilized in ways that the previous generations could scarcely imagine. Troops were moved en masse across continents, ships brimming with men, horses, and supplies crisscrossed the globe, and railways and roads were pressed into service for the war effort, carrying people into unprecedented proximity and spreading pathogens in ways that were invisible, insidious, and unstoppable. It was a world already vulnerable, a world in which human networks have been intensified, yet weakened by conflict, hunger, and disease. In the crowded camps along the Western Front, men lived shoulder to shoulder in conditions that offered little defense against illness. Trenches were cold and damp, a breeding ground for infections that preyed on exhausted immune systems. Soldiers often shared the same blankets, the same utensils, and the same latrines, unwittingly creating a lattice of contagion. It was here, in these transient communities of the front line, that the first whispers of a new, invisible threat began to circulate. There was nothing dramatic, nothing immediately terrifying about the early signs. Ordinary fevers, mild coughs, and transient fatigue were noted and dismissed as the routine seasonal illnesses that always accompanied soldiers into winter. Medical officers documented cases in their ledgers, often attributing symptoms to poor diet, the stress of combat, or overcrowding. Few could have foreseen the trajectory that these seemingly ordinary illnesses would take in the weeks to come. Away from the battlefields, civilian populations were equally susceptible. European cities were swollen with displaced persons, with families sheltering in cramped apartments and boarding houses. Public transportation, streetcars, trains, and ferries were overcrowded as workers traveled to factories supporting the war effort. Markets, theaters, and churches were full, each a nexus of human interaction that accelerated the invisible circulation of pathogens. Hospitals, already under strain from wartime injuries, struggled to accommodate the influx of the sick and the wounded. Medical resources were stretched thin, and in many places, sanitary conditions were declining under the pressure of urban congestion and wartime deprivation. Though newspapers occasionally noted rising absences from work or school due to illness, the reports were muted and often overshadowed by headlines of battlefield victories, political declarations, and the day-to-day exigencies of wartime administration. In this environment, the early spread of a new disease went largely unnoticed, passing from person to person, camp to city, unnoticed and unremarked. The war itself played an unintentional yet pivotal role in amplifying vulnerability. Millions of men and women were already weakened by chronic malnutrition, which compromised their immune systems. The stress of separation, the anxiety of loss, and the mental toll of constant danger left populations less capable of resisting infection. Military hospitals, forced to deal with casualties from the front as well as endemic illnesses, were ill-equipped to recognize or respond to a disease that did not follow the patterns of familiar influenza strains. Laboratories were focused on battlefield medicine and chemical warfare. The study of emerging viral infections was nascent at best. In this sense, the world's attention was fragmented, dispersed, and fundamentally unprepared for the scale of what was about to unfold. Even geography and climate played roles in creating susceptibility. Soldiers huddled in tents and trenches endured wet, cold winters that lowered resistance to infection. In ports and rail hubs, the movement of troops across national borders allowed viruses to leap thousands of miles within days. Coastal cities in Spain, Portugal, and France, with their constant maritime traffic, were naturally exposed to pathogens carried by travelers and sailors. In rural areas, isolated communities that had historically been spared the worst of seasonal epidemics were suddenly within reach of contagion as war-driven mobilization reached deeper into the countryside. Everywhere, the basic structures of society, homes, hospitals, barracks, transport networks, were pressed to the breaking point, leaving populations unusually exposed to infection. Perhaps most striking was the invisibility of the threat. Unlike artillery or chemical attacks, which could be seen, heard, and felt, this new danger manifested as subtle aches, mild fevers, and fleeting fatigue. Its presence was intangible, and its potential catastrophic scale entirely unrecognized. It moved through networks of human movement and human labor, exploiting proximity and exhaustion rather than physical vulnerability alone. Those who first contracted it often recovered quickly, lending a false sense of reassurance. Physicians and military officials were left grappling with an illness that seemed ordinary at first glance, yet carried within it the potential for devastation that no one could yet comprehend. At the same time, the cultural and institutional frameworks of the era contributed to the disease's quiet proliferation. Wartime censorship, intended to maintain morale and prevent enemy advantage, suppressed discussion of disease outbreaks among the military and civilian population. Governments prioritized secrecy over transparency. In Germany, France, and Britain, reporting on sickness among troops was heavily regulated. Newspapers were instructed to minimize coverage that could be interpreted as a sign of weakness or failure. The public, therefore, remained largely unaware of the early signals, interpreting local waves of influenza as a routine inconvenience rather than a harbinger of a global catastrophe. In neutral Spain, where press freedoms were less restricted, reports of rising illness were more open, inadvertently giving the pandemic its name in the international imagination. Yet even here, the scale of mortality was not yet grasped, and the significance of the disease remained obscured by other political and social upheavals. The conditions for the Spanish flu were, in retrospect, a perfect storm. It was a world simultaneously hyper-connected and fractured, mobilized yet exhausted, attentive to war but blind to a microscopic enemy moving in parallel. Soldiers moved across continents. Refugees crossed borders. Trade ships and merchant vessels carried more than goods. Cities were crowded with the vulnerable. Hospitals strained under dual pressures of war injuries and common disease. Every structural weakness, overcrowding, malnutrition, stress, inadequate sanitation, became a vector. Every social policy, censorship, forced mobilization, rationing, amplified the disease's reach. The pandemic did not appear as a singular moment of terror. It emerged gradually, almost imperceptibly, riding on the back of human systems that were already vulnerable. By the autumn of 1918, these conditions had converged in a way that no contemporary observer could have fully anticipated. Soldiers returning from the front carried with them not only the physical and emotional scars of combat, but also an invisible companion capable of killing at unprecedented speed. Urban populations, already weakened by wartime privations, were unknowingly incubating what would soon become the deadliest pandemic in recorded history. And yet, in this early phase, there was no dramatic climax, no heralded announcement of catastrophe. The disease advanced quietly, deliberately, as if testing the resilience of human society before revealing the full scale of its power. This was a world on the cusp of a calamity that would leave tens of millions dead. Yet in these first months, it seemed only a minor inconvenience, a background illness amid the cacophony of war. Soldiers coughed in tents, children missed school, workers called in sick, and doctors scribbled notes in ledger books. Life continued, almost unaware of the storm gathering across continents. And in that very unremarkable quietness, the Spanish flu found its opportunity, moving invisibly through the veins of an exhausted humanity, waiting to awaken its full, terrifying potential. The first chapter of this story is not one of spectacle or drama. It is the story of vulnerability, of conditions meticulously set for a crisis that would soon engulf the world. It is a world already fragile, a world whose population had been tested to its limits by war, displacement, and scarcity. And it is into this world that the Spanish flu would emerge, not with fanfare, but as an invisible, inexorable force, reshaping the course of history in ways that no contemporary observer could yet imagine. In the months that followed the initial stirrings of illness among soldiers and civilians, the disease began to reveal itself in a way that would eventually alarm historians, though at the time it was largely dismissed. Early outbreaks appeared ordinary, almost banal, and were often mistaken for the common seasonal flu that swept through Europe each winter. Soldiers in the trenches coughed and sneezed, returned to their barracks fatigued, and were prescribed rest or simple tonics before being sent back to the front. Civilians reported mild fevers, body aches, and short-lived exhaustion. Doctors noted the symptoms in their ledgers, yet there was little that distinguished this new influenza from the countless minor illnesses that perennially afflicted a population already weakened by war, hunger, and stress. In the absence of remarkable mortality or dramatic presentations, the illness failed to attract public attention, and it advanced quietly, almost invisibly, across towns, cities, and continents. Despite its apparent mundanity, the virus was already learning, adapting, and spreading with a subtle efficiency that belied the small number of recorded cases. Its initial manifestations were deceptive, often resolving on their own, giving patients a false sense of recovery. This early camouflage allowed the pathogen to move unnoticed through human networks, hopping from one host to another, traveling with soldiers, laborers, and travelers. Railways, troop transports, and bustling ports served as arteries through which the virus could circulate rapidly. In some instances, individuals carrying the virus appeared completely healthy, acting as unwitting vectors, a fact that would later contribute to the unprecedented speed and scale of the pandemic. At the same time, societal conditions amplified the virus's potential. Cities remained crowded with workers engaged in war production, while homes often accommodated multiple families or refugees, increasing contact among diverse populations. Public spaces, markets, theaters, and schools remained densely packed, and efforts to maintain hygiene were constrained by scarcity of clean water, soap, and medical supplies. Medical institutions, already under tremendous strain treating wounded soldiers, had little capacity to investigate or contain a novel respiratory disease. In many cases, influenza was regarded as an inevitable and unremarkable feature of urban life, a background irritation rather than a mortal threat. The early spread of the illness highlights the complex interplay of human behavior, environmental factors, and institutional limitations. Soldiers moved between front lines and home territories, crossing borders and oceans, carrying with them more than their fatigue and trauma. Civilians migrated to urban centers for work or were displaced by the destruction of war, unintentionally creating a lattice of human networks perfectly suited for the virus to traverse. Hospitals and clinics, designed for war injuries rather than epidemic containment, became inadvertent hubs of transmission. Even basic public health measures, quarantine, isolation, and reporting, were inconsistently applied, constrained by the limitations of wartime administration and by the absence of coordinated international protocols for managing an influenza outbreak. In this early stage, the disease revealed a troubling subtlety. It often affected young, otherwise healthy adults, producing symptoms that seemed mild or fleeting. Doctors and public health officials, accustomed to influenza that disproportionately impacted the elderly or infirm, were initially confounded. There was a sense of uncertainty, a dissonance between the appearance of the illness and the potential for harm that lay beneath. This ambiguity delayed decisive action, allowing the pathogen to consolidate its foothold across populations. Small clusters of cases were often written off as routine seasonal infections, and the absence of striking mortality led to a false sense of security among both medical professionals and the general public. The role of war censorship in this period cannot be overstated. Governments seeking to maintain morale and protect national security downplayed reports of illness among troops and civilians. In Britain, France, and Germany, newspapers were instructed to minimize coverage of widespread sickness, particularly among soldiers at the front. Statistics were often withheld or sanitized, and the severity of outbreaks was obscured behind euphemistic language. This created a fragmented perception of reality. Local authorities and physicians may have recognized unusual clusters of illness, yet the broader population remained largely uninformed. In contrast, neutral countries such as Spain reported openly, providing the international media with the first detailed accounts of the disease's spread. Ironically, this transparency resulted in the virus being labeled the Spanish flu, despite its existence and circulation well beyond the Iberian Peninsula. The virus's adaptability became increasingly apparent as it progressed through different populations. Early observations hinted at patterns that distinguished it from previous influenza strains. Infections could appear mild in one host, but rapidly escalate in another. Symptoms varied widely, from low-grade fevers and headaches to severe respiratory distress. In some communities, entire households fell ill in succession, while neighboring homes remained relatively unaffected, suggesting that a complex combination of environmental, genetic, and social factors influenced transmission. Contemporary physicians struggled to reconcile these patterns with existing knowledge, lacking the virology and epidemiology frameworks that modern science would later provide. As the illness moved through European cities and military camps, small anomalies began to emerge. Mortality rates in certain cohorts appeared unexpectedly high, and the speed of transmission increased. Reports of patients deteriorating within days, rather than weeks, began to accumulate. Yet the signals remained diffuse and inconsistent, masked by the enormity of wartime mortality from combat, malnutrition, and other infectious diseases. In this sense, the disease was extraordinarily insidious. It did not announce itself with spectacle or drama, but gradually embedded itself into human populations, exploiting vulnerabilities that were both social and biological. This period also illustrates the interplay between human perception and epidemiological reality. Ordinary people, preoccupied with the exigencies of war and daily survival, were poorly positioned to recognize the early signs of a pandemic. Mild fevers and fatigue were readily attributed to overwork, cold weather, or minor illnesses. Even trained medical professionals, overwhelmed and operating under extreme pressure, struggled to distinguish this new threat from familiar seasonal patterns. The subtlety of the disease's early expression allowed it to establish a foothold before public concern could mobilize meaningful response. Moreover, the movement of troops returning from the front line introduced the disease into populations that had previously experienced little exposure. In cities such as Paris, London, and New York, waves of infection coincided with the arrival of soldiers from various theaters of war. The social and logistical structures designed to manage post-war demobilization inadvertently facilitated the spread of the virus. Crowded train stations, transport ships, and temporary housing became conduits for transmission. In many cases, local authorities were unprepared to manage these influxes, and the population, largely unaware of the evolving threat, went about daily life in a state of normalcy that concealed the gathering storm. Despite the absence of immediate crisis, the disease's quiet spread was already reshaping human experience. Families began to notice unusual patterns of illness within households. Schools recorded higher absenteeism. Employers confronted clusters of sick workers, reducing productivity and straining already stressed industries. Hospitals, often underfunded and poorly supplied due to wartime priorities, began to see a slow but steady increase in patients presenting with flu-like symptoms. Even in the absence of alarming mortality, these patterns signaled that a significant public health event was underway, one that would soon escalate far beyond the capacity of existing systems to manage. By the end of this phase, the early influenza outbreak had established itself across continents, moving through military, urban and rural networks alike. It had exploited the vulnerabilities of a world exhausted by war, nourished by human mobility, and constrained by institutional limitations. Its subtlety allowed it to evade early detection, yet its potential for devastation had already been written into the fabric of global society. The illness was no longer confined to isolated clusters. It had achieved a presence that would make containment impossible. In retrospect, this period represents the crucial incubation phase of the pandemic. It is a story of invisibility and quiet proliferation, of human systems ill-equipped to recognize and respond to a novel threat. The Spanish flu did not announce itself with spectacle. It advanced silently, taking advantage of a world already weakened by conflict, scarcity, and social disruption. It was a pathogen moving with precision, exploiting the patterns of human behavior, and waiting for the moment when its lethality would become undeniable. In the lives of those experiencing it, the early outbreaks seemed unremarkable, almost routine. Soldiers felt fatigued, children missed school, and workers called in sick. Yet beneath this veneer of ordinary illness, the foundations of a global catastrophe were forming. The virus was learning, adapting, and preparing for the moment when the world's fragile equilibrium would be shattered. It was in these quiet months, before panic, before mass mortality, that the Spanish flu embedded itself into the rhythm of human life, poised to reveal the full scale of its destructive potential. The story of this phase is not one of spectacle or immediate horror, but of subtlety, invisibility, and inevitability. It is the narrative of a world moving unknowingly toward one of the deadliest pandemics in history, a world whose population had been weakened and mobilized in ways that made it uniquely susceptible to a microscopic and merciless adversary. The early spread of the disease illustrates that catastrophe often begins not with dramatic announcement, but with small, almost imperceptible signals, accumulating quietly until the weight of their consequence becomes impossible to ignore. As the illness spread quietly across cities and military encampments, the machinery of war itself began to shape public perception of the emerging threat. Governments, intent on preserving morale and maintaining control over societies already strained by conflict, imposed strict censorship on news about illness and mortality. Official channels emphasized victory, progress, and resilience, downplaying or entirely suppressing reports of disease among troops and civilians. In Germany, France, and Britain, newspapers were instructed to minimize coverage of influenza outbreaks, particularly when they occurred in military camps, factories, or urban centers. Editors were wary of releasing information that could be interpreted as weakness, and military authorities closely monitored correspondence to ensure that no details of widespread sickness reached the public. This climate of suppression meant that early warning signals, though present in medical and administrative records, rarely reached ordinary citizens. Families might notice higher than usual absenteeism among workers or school children, but without authoritative confirmation, the scale and seriousness of the illness remained ambiguous. In neutral countries, however, the story was different. Spain, which had not participated in the war, maintained a relatively free press and reported openly on the growing incidence of influenza. Newspapers described hospitals filled beyond capacity, rising death tolls, and communities struggling to respond. These reports, circulated internationally, provided the first widely accessible evidence that something beyond the ordinary seasonal flu was unfolding. Ironically, this transparency gave the pandemic its name. Even though Spain was not the point of origin and its citizens experienced mortality rates similar to those elsewhere. For much of Europe, the war-driven silence, and for Spain, the candid reporting, set up a distorted map of understanding, one in which the true reach of the virus remained partially obscured. Censorship was not the only factor that shaped the early trajectory of the pandemic. The social and political structures of wartime society actively facilitated the virus's transmission. Troop movements continued unabated, ferrying millions of men across borders, continents, and oceans. Soldiers returning home on leave or being reassigned between fronts carried infections into regions that had experienced minimal exposure. Ports, rail hubs, and barracks acted as conduits, concentrating individuals from disparate regions in close quarters, creating ideal conditions for transmission. In cities, factories remained crowded. Housing shortages forced multiple families into single apartments, and public transportation was packed, ensuring frequent and unavoidable contact. The war had created an intricate web of human connectivity, mobility, and vulnerability, a lattice along which the influenza virus could move with remarkable efficiency. Hospitals and medical facilities, already overburdened by injuries and diseases linked to war, were ill-prepared to identify or isolate this new pathogen. Medical professionals faced the paradox of a highly transmissible disease that appeared mild in many cases, masking its lethal potential. Doctors recorded symptoms that included fever, chills, headache, and cough, often prescribing rest or basic remedies. But the illness occasionally escalated rapidly, causing severe respiratory distress and death in previously healthy young adults. This unpredictability frustrated physicians accustomed to patterns of seasonal influenza that typically targeted the very young, the elderly, or the chronically ill. Even when clusters of severe cases appeared, the cause and effect relationship between transmission and fatality remained unclear. Hospitals inadvertently became sites of contagion, as patients seeking treatment exposed caregivers, fellow patients, and staff to the virus. Medical understanding lagged behind the speed of the outbreak, a gap that the pathogen exploited with devastating effect. The interaction between war censorship and medical uncertainty produced a striking psychological environment. Ordinary citizens were largely unaware of the scale of the threat, while doctors and public health officials were confronted with conflicting evidence. Reports of rising absenteeism, increased mortality, and sudden deterioration of patients were often compartmentalized, localized, and rarely synthesized into a coherent national or international picture. This fragmentation slowed recognition of a pattern that, in retrospect, was already apparent. Communities went about daily life with a tenuous sense of normalcy, unknowingly providing the virus with the conditions it required to establish itself firmly in the population. Meanwhile, the disease displayed a disturbing versatility. Early cases demonstrated that it could strike across age groups, although some demographic patterns were not yet fully appreciated. Unlike traditional influenza strains, which primarily affected the elderly or chronically ill, this pathogen appeared capable of overwhelming even the healthiest adults. In military camps, previously robust soldiers fell ill with alarming speed. Civilians who had managed to survive the deprivations of war suddenly confronted a new vulnerability. Their immune systems weakened by years of scarcity, stress, and malnutrition. The virus was not selective in the conventional sense. Its lethality was uneven but often brutal, exploiting weaknesses created by the social and physical conditions of the time. Geography further influenced the progression of the outbreak. Urban centers, with their high population density and constant movement of people, became incubators for transmission. Rural areas, by contrast, initially experienced slower spread, though this was often temporary. Seasonal migration, wartime conscription, and the return of soldiers ensured that no community remained insulated for long. Even remote villages eventually encountered the virus, as trade, transport, and communication linked previously isolated populations to the broader pandemic network. In this way, the influenza transcended both social and geographical boundaries, revealing the interconnected vulnerability of an increasingly mobile, industrialized, and globalized world. The social consequences of these dynamics were significant, even in this early phase. Communities began to notice patterns of illness that exceeded normal expectations. Schools recorded higher rates of absenteeism. Workplaces struggled with staff shortages. Families experienced successive waves of infection within households. Yet without authoritative confirmation or clear guidance, these signs were often dismissed as ordinary misfortune or as the natural consequences of war and deprivation. Individuals attempted to manage risk through personal hygiene, self-isolation, or avoidance of crowds, but such measures were only partially effective in the absence of coordinated public health strategies. The virus, moving along pre-existing human networks, effectively outpaced these localized, informal interventions. As the influenza moved across Europe, it also began to reach other continents. Trade routes, troop deployments, and shipping lines transported the pathogen to North America, Africa, and Asia. The speed of global movement, accelerated by wartime logistics, allowed the disease to traverse oceans with unprecedented efficiency. In many port cities, the arrival of infected sailors or soldiers led to localized outbreaks that would later merge into broader epidemics. By this stage, it was clear to medical observers that the disease was not confined to a single country or population. It was a global phenomenon in the making, a reality that was obscured by the localized nature of news reporting and the fragmentary nature of early epidemiological data. The early spread of the disease also exposed systemic inequalities. Populations already marginalized by poverty, colonialism, or displacement suffered disproportionate exposure and vulnerability. Crowded living conditions, inadequate nutrition, and limited access to medical care created conditions in which the virus could inflict the greatest harm. In contrast, wealthier or better provision communities often experienced milder outcomes, reflecting the intersection of social structure and biological vulnerability. These disparities, largely invisible in wartime reporting, foreshadowed the inequities in mortality and morbidity that would become tragically evident as the pandemic progressed. By the time winter arrived, the virus had already established a foothold across multiple countries. Its presence was no longer subtle, though public awareness remained uneven. Medical and public health authorities struggled to respond, constrained by the twin pressures of war and incomplete knowledge. Hospitals were filling with patients, families were falling ill in rapid succession, and mortality rates, though initially moderate, were beginning to climb in certain locations. Yet for the general population, daily life continued largely under the assumption of normalcy. People attended work, traveled, and socialized, unknowingly perpetuating the spread of the disease. The early months of the outbreak, then, represent a period of quiet, almost imperceptible escalation. There were no dramatic announcements or sudden surges of visible horror. Instead, the pandemic advanced through human systems that were already stressed, exploiting vulnerabilities created by war, mobility, and social inequality. It was a disease that thrived on normality, moving efficiently through the routines of life and waiting until the conditions were ripe for wider, more lethal waves. In this sense, the story of this phase is one of deception. What appeared to be routine illness masked the emergence of a pathogen that would soon reshape the world. This period also underscores the interplay between perception and reality in the early history of the pandemic. Citizens interpreted mild symptoms as ordinary. Medical authorities grappled with unusual patterns, and governments sought to control information rather than confront the disease openly. Yet the virus continued to move, following predictable patterns of human contact, exploiting social structures, and silently embedding itself in communities across continents. By the end of this phase, it had become clear to those who observed carefully that the influenza was no longer merely a minor nuisance. It was a global phenomenon, spreading quietly but inexorably, poised to escalate into one of the deadliest pandemics in human history. In retrospect, this early stage illustrates the fundamental dynamics that allowed the pandemic to succeed: invisibility, adaptability, human mobility, social inequity, and institutional limitations. The virus moved undetected through networks created by war, reshaping societies even before mortality became widespread. Its early spread was facilitated not by dramatic events or overt signals, but by the ordinary rhythms of life in a world already fatigued and vulnerable. Understanding this phase is critical, for it reveals how pandemics exploit the mundane as much as the extraordinary, and how human systems, unprepared and fragmented, can inadvertently accelerate the spread of an invisible adversary. By the spring of 1918, the influenza that had quietly circulated through military camps and civilian populations began to exhibit patterns that alarmed medical observers, though public awareness remained limited. What had once appeared to be routine, seasonal illness now revealed an unsettling capacity for sudden severity. Early cases that had been mild were followed by a second wave of infections characterized by rapid progression, violent respiratory symptoms, and unexpectedly high mortality rates. This transformation was subtle at first, occurring incrementally across regions and populations, yet it signaled a profound change in the nature of the pathogen. The virus was no longer simply another seasonal influenza. It was evolving into a form capable of overwhelming healthy adults, a feature that set it apart from every influenza outbreak previously recorded. The transformation of the disease into a far deadlier strain can be traced, in part, to the conditions created by the war. Soldiers, already weakened by malnutrition, stress, and exposure to chemical agents and environmental extremes, became incubators in which the virus could replicate and mutate. Crowded trenches, barracks, and transport ships facilitated rapid transmission, while repeated exposure to hosts allowed the pathogen to adapt and refine its lethality. Unlike typical influenza, which disproportionately affected the very young and the elderly, this strain began to target robust young adults, often producing catastrophic immune responses. Physicians began to note alarming clinical signs. Patients who had appeared mildly ill could, within hours, develop severe pneumonia, hemorrhaging, and extreme respiratory distress. Mortality, once largely predictable by age and underlying conditions, now struck indiscriminately, creating a profound sense of uncertainty among the medical profession. Urban centers, already strained by war mobilization, became focal points for the escalating threat. Factories, offices, and public transport systems concentrated workers in confined spaces, allowing the virus to spread efficiently. Hospitals, still overburdened from the care of wartime injuries, struggled to accommodate the rising influx of influenza patients. Beds were scarce, and resources such as oxygen, ventilators, and basic medications were largely non-existent. In many cities, temporary wards were hastily erected in school halls, gymnasiums, and even private homes. Caregivers, themselves vulnerable, became vectors, inadvertently transmitting the virus to others. This pattern of rapid, localized transmission foreshadowed the global scale of devastation that would soon unfold. Simultaneously, the illness began to manifest a shocking variability in its progression. Some patients experienced only mild symptoms and recovered quickly, while others deteriorated rapidly, often succumbing within a matter of days. The mechanism of this variability was not understood at the time. Physicians hypothesized that prior exposure to influenza strains might confer partial immunity, or that environmental and nutritional factors played a decisive role, but such explanations could only partially account for the stark differences in outcomes. The unpredictability contributed to an atmosphere of fear and confusion, even before mortality reached its peak. Families observed neighbors falling gravely ill while those in similar circumstances remained unaffected, a pattern that reinforced the invisible and seemingly arbitrary nature of the threat. The evolving virulence of the virus also challenged the existing frameworks of public health. Quarantine measures, which had been partially effective against localized outbreaks, proved inadequate when confronted with a pathogen capable of rapid person-to-person transmission and silent incubation. Cities implemented closures of schools, theaters, and public gathering spaces, but such interventions were inconsistently applied and often came too late to prevent significant spread. Health authorities struggled to balance the competing demands of wartime production, civilian mobility, and disease containment. Public compliance varied, particularly in communities fatigued by years of conflict and deprivation, further undermining the effectiveness of preventive measures. International movement played an equally crucial role in escalating the crisis. Troop transports, merchant ships, and rail networks acted as vectors, carrying the virus across continents with alarming efficiency. Soldiers returning home, often without medical evaluation, introduced the pathogen into regions that had previously been largely untouched. Remote villages, previously insulated by geography, experienced outbreaks once trade and labor networks brought them into contact with infected individuals. Ports and railway hubs became critical nodes in a rapidly expanding network of contagion, linking distant populations in a shared vulnerability. The global mobility of human populations, amplified by wartime logistics, ensured that no region remained untouched for long. The social consequences of the virus's rising lethality were immediate and profound. Families confronted the sudden loss of young adults, the very members of society who had previously been considered the most resilient. Communities began to notice patterns of simultaneous illness and death that disrupted normal social structures. Religious institutions, often central to community cohesion, struggled to perform rites and funerals at the pace demanded by mortality. Schools closed not only to protect children, but because teachers were falling ill or dying. Workplaces, already under strain from wartime demands, faced absenteeism that threatened both productivity and social stability. The virus, through its stealth and severity, revealed the fragility of human networks at every level. Medical professionals faced an extraordinary challenge. Lacking antibiotics, antivirals, or an understanding of viral pathophysiology, they relied on supportive care, nursing, and improvised interventions. Some experimented with experimental treatments ranging from oxygen therapy to herbal remedies, but outcomes were largely determined by the patient's immune response and overall health rather than the quality of medical care. Hospitals were forced to prioritize care, often sending patients home who might have benefited from continuous observation. The unpredictability of the disease and the scarcity of resources created profound ethical dilemmas for doctors and caregivers, highlighting the limits of medical knowledge in the face of a novel pathogen. Cultural responses to the growing threat also shaped its trajectory. In some communities, fear prompted early forms of social distancing. Markets emptied, public gatherings diminished, and travel was voluntarily curtailed. In others, fatigue, denial, or economic necessity led people to continue daily routines despite the risk. These differing responses affected the virus's spread in uneven ways, producing clusters of rapid transmission alongside pockets of relative containment. The interplay between human behavior and viral adaptation demonstrates how pandemics are not merely biological events, but also social phenomena, influenced by perceptions, choices, and institutional capacities. As the virus continued to evolve, reports began to emerge of particularly severe outbreaks in military camps and urban centers. Entire units experienced high rates of illness, with some regiments losing a significant portion of their soldiers to fever, pneumonia, and hemorrhaging. In cities such as Philadelphia, Boston, and New York, hospitals overflowed and makeshift treatment centers struggled to manage the caseload. The rapid escalation of mortality, particularly among young adults, captured public attention and began to erode the previously enforced silence surrounding the disease. Despite this, official acknowledgement remained cautious, constrained by the lingering imperatives of war reporting and public morale. By the middle of 1918, the virus had achieved a combination of high transmissibility and lethality that would define the course of the pandemic. The early period of quiet spread had transitioned into a phase of active devastation. Yet even in this escalation, the pathogen maintained its subtlety. It struck unpredictably, exploiting social, environmental, and biological vulnerabilities and resisted attempts at containment through conventional public health measures. Its lethality was amplified by human systems, overcrowding, malnutrition, and movement patterns that were already compromised by war. In this sense, the pandemic was both a natural and a social phenomenon, emerging from the intersection of pathogen and human circumstance. The psychological impact of this transformation cannot be overstated. Families, communities, and medical professionals confronted a disease that violated every expectation of normal influenza. Young, healthy adults who had survived years of war and deprivation were now vulnerable to sudden, lethal illness. Mortality statistics, when they became available, revealed stark inequalities, with marginalized populations often bearing the heaviest burden. The virus exposed both the biological susceptibility of humanity and the social vulnerabilities embedded in infrastructure, policy, and cultural practice. This period also highlights the limits of prediction and preparation. Despite early warnings, the global systems in place, medical, governmental, and social, were unable to anticipate the magnitude of the threat. Hospitals were under-resourced, public health messaging was fragmented, and the global movement of people continued largely unchecked. The virus exploited these weaknesses, reinforcing the principle that pandemics are as much about human systems as they are about microbial biology. By the close of this phase, the influenza had transformed from a quiet, almost imperceptible nuisance into a force capable of overwhelming individuals, communities, and entire regions. The mutation of the virus, its evolving lethality, and its capacity to exploit social and environmental conditions set the stage for the subsequent waves of mortality that would make the 1918 pandemic one of the deadliest events in human history. The world, still preoccupied with the devastation of war, was now confronting an invisible adversary whose full scale and consequences were only beginning to become apparent. The story of this period is not one of spectacle, but of incremental escalation and inevitable consequence. It is the narrative of a virus learning to exploit human networks, a society unprepared to recognize its threat, and the first clear indications that the influenza of 1918 would be unlike any disease humanity had previously encountered. It is a chapter in which quiet adaptation meets human vulnerability, in which mortality begins to rise not in dramatic arcs, but through a relentless, almost invisible process of biological evolution and social amplification. The transformation of the virus during this period would ensure that the coming months were not merely an extension of seasonal illness, but a historical turning point that would leave its mark on every continent and every community it touched. By the summer of 1918, the influenza pandemic had evolved from a hidden and localized threat into a full-blown crisis, and its impact on urban centers became increasingly apparent. Cities, already strained by the demands of war, found themselves under tremendous pressure as the virus moved through dense populations with relentless efficiency. Streets that had once been bustling with workers, children, and shoppers became sites of vulnerability rather than activity, while hospitals and clinics, the traditional institutions for managing illness, struggled to accommodate an ever-growing influx of patients. The scale of infection revealed the fragility of social infrastructure that had been assumed to be resilient, highlighting the limitations of human systems in the face of a highly transmissible and deadly pathogen. Urban hospitals were the first and most visible point of crisis. Facilities that had been designed to treat war injuries were quickly overwhelmed by the flood of influenza patients. Beds were scarce, and medical staff, themselves falling ill at alarming rates, were often forced to prioritize care in ways that left some patients without attention. Operating theaters were repurposed for basic treatment. Waiting rooms became temporary wards, and the limited supply of essential medicines, bandages, and blankets created conditions in which even minor ailments could become life-threatening. Nurses, doctors, and orderlies worked under exhausting conditions, sometimes attending to dozens of patients at once. Yet the relentless pace meant that care could only mitigate symptoms rather than cure the underlying disease. Hospitals, intended as sanctuaries of healing, inadvertently became amplifiers of contagion, as the proximity of patients and the absence of effective isolation measures allowed the virus to circulate with minimal resistance. The impact of the pandemic extended far beyond hospitals. Public services, already burdened by wartime mobilization, began to falter. Transportation systems, essential for moving goods and people, suffered from staff shortages as drivers, conductors, and maintenance crews succumbed to illness. Streets and subways, once conduits for commerce and social life, became sites of exposure and anxiety. Police, firefighters, and sanitation workers, essential for maintaining order and hygiene, were also affected, further straining urban management. Factories and industrial plants, crucial for wartime production, faced absenteeism rates that disrupted output and threatened supply chains. In every sector, the virus revealed the interdependence of modern cities and the vulnerability of those systems to biological disruption. Schools and educational institutions became microcosms of the broader crisis. Classrooms, filled with children in close proximity, allowed for rapid transmission, forcing many schools to close temporarily. Teachers and staff, themselves susceptible, were often unavailable, further complicating continuity of education. The closures had ripple effects. Parents had to remain home to care for children, reducing workforce participation, while communities struggled to maintain routines essential for social stability. In this way, the pandemic disrupted not only health systems but the social and economic fabric of urban life, underscoring the multifaceted consequences of a highly contagious disease. The density of urban populations amplified the virus's lethality. Overcrowded housing, particularly in working-class districts, created environments in which infection could pass from one household to another with startling speed. Families often shared single rooms or apartments, and communal amenities such as latrines and wells facilitated transmission. Food shortages and malnutrition, already common due to wartime rationing, weakened immune responses, making even otherwise healthy individuals more susceptible to severe illness. In wealthier districts, residents were somewhat better insulated, with larger homes and access to private medical care, yet no population was entirely immune. The pandemic, in this sense, exposed the stark inequalities inherent in urban living while simultaneously challenging the assumption that wealth or privilege could provide complete protection against a microscopic threat. The city itself became a theater of both crisis and adaptation. Public health authorities, recognizing the limitations of traditional hospital care, experimented with emergency measures to contain the spread. Temporary isolation wards were established in public buildings. Volunteers distributed food and basic medical supplies to the sick, and municipal authorities issued guidelines on hygiene, social distancing, and mask wearing. Yet these interventions were unevenly applied and often met with resistance or incomprehension. Public compliance varied widely, influenced by fatigue, skepticism, and the competing demands of economic survival. The virus's efficiency in exploiting gaps in social organization meant that even well-intentioned measures were only partially effective. Mortality rates in urban centers began to climb dramatically. In some districts, entire neighborhoods experienced waves of illness that overwhelmed families and local services. The rapid onset of symptoms, high fever, severe cough, and acute respiratory distress, often left little time for effective medical intervention. Funerals and burial practices were disrupted, with cemeteries struggling to accommodate the growing number of deaths. Religious and cultural practices, which traditionally provided solace and structure, were constrained by the sheer scale of mortality. Communities were forced to adapt, improvising rituals and support systems while grappling with the pervasive presence of death. The psychological impact of this urban crisis was profound. Citizens confronted a threat that was invisible, unpredictable, and inescapable. Unlike the visible dangers of artillery or fire, the virus was a silent predator, capable of striking anyone, anywhere, at any time. Anxiety permeated daily life, influencing behaviors, interactions, and decisions. Streets that had once been spaces of commerce and social exchange became arenas of caution and fear. Parents watched over children with heightened vigilance. Neighbors monitored each other's health, and workplaces struggled to maintain routines under the shadow of illness. The pandemic, in this sense, reshaped not only the physical environment, but also the social and emotional landscape of the city. Public infrastructure faced unprecedented strain. Water supplies, sanitation systems, and waste removal services were compromised as workers fell ill. In some cities, garbage accumulated in streets, latrines overflowed, and basic hygiene standards declined, inadvertently creating conditions favorable to secondary infections. Utilities such as gas, electricity, and transportation, while not directly linked to the virus, became vulnerable as human operators succumbed to illness. Urban resilience, long assumed to be a function of planning and engineering, proved contingent on human labor and maintenance, revealing a hidden fragility in systems that appeared robust on the surface. Economic consequences were equally severe. Factories faced reduced output due to absenteeism, transportation delays disrupted supply chains, and small businesses struggled to maintain operations in the face of widespread illness. The workforce, already depleted by military conscription and wartime casualties, was further diminished by the pandemic. Wages and production were affected, and the informal economy, reliant on human proximity, suffered severe setbacks. The virus did not merely challenge health systems. It undermined the economic and social vitality of urban centers, highlighting the interconnection between biological and societal resilience. The human experience of the pandemic was intensely personal and communal simultaneously. Families experienced the loss of multiple members in quick succession, while neighbors confronted the shared vulnerability of urban life. Social networks, traditionally sources of support, were disrupted by illness and fear. Communities adapted through informal networks of care. Volunteers delivered food and medicine. Neighbors monitored the sick, and religious or charitable institutions attempted to fill gaps left by overstretched municipal services. These adaptations reveal the resourcefulness of societies under extreme pressure, yet also highlight the limitations imposed by scale, density, and contagion. Despite these immense pressures, the virus continued to spread, exploiting every opportunity offered by the urban environment. Crowded markets, public gatherings, and communal facilities facilitated transmission. Even temporary closures and public health interventions could not entirely halt the advance of the disease, as asymptomatic carriers and delayed recognition allowed the virus to leap from neighborhood to neighborhood. The urban landscape, designed for human productivity and interaction, inadvertently became a network of vulnerability, amplifying both the speed and impact of the pandemic. By the end of this period, it was clear that cities, long considered centers of human innovation and resilience, had become epicenters of the pandemic's power. The strain on hospitals, infrastructure, and social networks revealed both the biological and social vulnerability inherent in dense populations. Mortality was rising, fear was widespread, and institutions were pushed to their limits. Yet even in the midst of crisis, human adaptation and improvisation demonstrated resilience, offering glimpses of the capacity to endure, reorganize, and survive. The interplay of viral lethality, social structure, and urban density created a dynamic that would define the course of the pandemic, setting the stage for subsequent waves of illness and mortality. This period illustrates the broader principle that pandemics are not only biological events, but social phenomena. The virus exploited human systems, housing, transportation, labor, healthcare, not merely individual susceptibility. Urban centers, with their density, mobility, and interconnectedness, became both incubators and amplifiers of contagion. The pandemic revealed the extent to which modern life depended on human networks, and how the breakdown or stress of these networks could magnify the impact of a biological threat. The story of this stage is one of relentless pressure on human systems. Hospitals overflowed, public services faltered, families struggled to cope, and communities were forced to improvise in response to a threat that seemed both inevitable and inescapable. The virus did not strike evenly. It exploited the vulnerabilities of those already marginalized, while also threatening those previously considered resilient. Cities, as centers of human concentration and activity, became the most visible sites of the pandemic's power, demonstrating how social, environmental, and biological factors converge to produce a crisis of unprecedented scope. By the close of this phase, the pandemic had transformed urban life, leaving cities reeling from the combined effects of illness, mortality, social disruption, and economic strain. The influenza was no longer a silent or hidden presence. It had asserted itself with force, reshaping human experience at every level. The stage was set for subsequent waves of infection, as the virus continued to circulate and adapt, exploiting both the vulnerability and resilience of human societies. Cities, the engines of human activity and progress, have become the crucible in which the full scale and impact of the 1918 pandemic would be revealed. As the influenza continued its relentless march through urban centers and military camps, it exposed the profound limitations of contemporary medicine. Hospitals, already overwhelmed by wounded soldiers and the regular influx of seasonal illnesses, were suddenly faced with patients whose disease progressed unpredictably and lethally. Physicians struggled to understand why previously healthy young adults were succumbing in large numbers, while others experienced only mild symptoms. Existing medical knowledge, developed for bacterial infections and traditional influenza strains, proved insufficient against a pathogen that moved quickly, struck indiscriminately, and evaded early recognition. The absence of effective treatments transformed hospitals into a battleground of improvisation, human resilience, and despair, as doctors and nurses confronted the virus with little more than supportive care and observation. Medical staff faced impossible dilemmas. The speed of deterioration in some patients left little time for intervention. High fevers, severe coughing, cyanosis, and respiratory failure occurred within hours or days, overwhelming the capacity of even the most prepared physicians. Ventilators, antibiotics, antivirals, and advanced respiratory support were decades away from development. Treatments relied largely on bed rest, hydration, and rudimentary nursing care. Some doctors experimented with oxygen therapy, the inhalation of steam, or rudimentary chemical agents in the hope of alleviating symptoms, but outcomes were inconsistent and often disappointing. Mortality was determined less by intervention than by the virus itself, revealing the vulnerability of human systems when confronted with a pathogen operating beyond the reach of contemporary science. The strain on medical personnel was immense. Nurses, doctors, and orderlies faced relentless exposure, often succumbing to the disease themselves. Hospitals were staffed at minimal levels, with surviving personnel forced to work double shifts under exhausting and emotionally taxing conditions. The psychological toll of witnessing rapid, frequent, and often inexplicable deaths was profound. Physicians were accustomed to treating illness and injury with some expectation of success, yet the influenza demonstrated that even skill, knowledge, and care could be powerless. Desperation coexisted with duty, as medical professionals labored not only to save lives, but also to maintain order, hygiene, and compassion amid circumstances that would have overwhelmed any system. Pharmaceutical interventions were largely non-existent. Antibiotics, which could later address secondary bacterial infections, such as pneumonia, were still decades away, and antiviral therapies had not yet been conceived. Vaccines for influenza did not exist, and efforts to create preventative measures were hindered by incomplete understanding of the virus's biology. Treatments were empirical at best, guided by observation and trial rather than proven scientific principles. Remedies ranged from herbal decoctions and tonics to steam inhalation and opiates for symptom relief. While some of these measures provided marginal comfort, they were unable to alter the course of the disease in patients with severe presentations. The limits of contemporary medicine were laid bare, illustrating the gap between human expectations of care and the realities imposed by a novel pathogen. Hospitals themselves became vectors for the spread of infection. Overcrowding, insufficient isolation measures, and the constant movement of patients and staff facilitated transmission within medical facilities. Beds were placed in close proximity, Wards were shared by multiple patients, and caregivers moved between rooms without the protective measures that modern infection control protocols would later mandate. In some cases, hospitals inadvertently amplified outbreaks, transforming sites of healing into nodes of contagion. These dynamics further complicated the work of physicians, who were forced to balance the imperative of care with the practical reality of containing a disease that thrived in human proximity. Rural communities, though initially less affected than dense urban centers, faced similar challenges. Physicians were often scarce, medical supplies limited, and facilities rudimentary. When influenza arrived, entire families might fall ill in rapid succession, leaving communities without available caregivers. Local remedies, folk medicine, and improvised care became essential, though their efficacy was inconsistent. The absence of trained personnel or structured medical infrastructure magnified mortality in these regions, demonstrating the interplay between geographic isolation, resource scarcity, and vulnerability to pandemic disease. Medical understanding of the virus lagged dangerously behind its progression. The nature of influenza as a viral pathogen was not yet recognized. Bacteriological models of disease dominated medical thought. Physicians observed secondary bacterial infections in patients, particularly pneumonia, and treated them with available remedies, yet they failed to address the underlying viral cause. This disconnect limited the effectiveness of interventions and reinforced the perception that the disease was both mysterious and unstoppable. Even as patterns emerged, high mortality among young adults, rapid progression, and waves of infection, the mechanisms driving these phenomena remained elusive. The gap between observation and explanation contributed to an atmosphere of uncertainty and fear, even within the professional medical community. Public health authorities struggled to respond in tandem with medical institutions. Cities attempted to implement emergency measures such as quarantine, the closure of schools, and restrictions on public gatherings, but these efforts were hampered by limited understanding of transmission and inconsistent enforcement. Communities relied on guidance from medical authorities who themselves were unsure of the most effective strategies. The combination of scientific uncertainty, social fatigue, and the logistical challenges of wartime governance created conditions in which the disease could spread with extraordinary efficiency. Even the best-intentioned interventions often arrived too late or were insufficient to alter the trajectory of infection. The emotional and psychological toll on patients and families compounded the physical devastation. Families witnessed rapid deterioration and death, sometimes within a single day. Traditional support networks were disrupted as caregivers fell ill alongside their patients. The sudden and often indiscriminate nature of mortality produced widespread anxiety, grief, and social dislocation. Communities were forced to adapt, improvising care for the sick, altering funeral practices, and relying on informal networks to provide support. The pandemic, in this sense, was not only a medical crisis, but also a profound social and cultural event, reshaping relationships, rituals, and expectations. The crisis also highlighted deep social inequities. Access to care was unequal, with wealthier individuals often able to secure private physicians or more spacious accommodations, while the poor, the displaced, and marginalized populations faced overcrowded living conditions and limited access to medical support. Mortality rates reflected these disparities, demonstrating that the virus did not act in a vacuum, but interacted with pre-existing social and economic vulnerabilities. In urban slums, where sanitation was poor and food insecurity high, entire households could be incapacitated simultaneously, while wealthier districts experienced lower mortality and greater capacity for care. These patterns underscore the intersection of biology and society, revealing that vulnerability to disease was shaped as much by circumstance as by the pathogen itself. Physicians and medical researchers attempted to make sense of the unfolding crisis. Hospitals collected records, clinical observations, and mortality data in the hope of identifying patterns. Some early epidemiological work was undertaken, though it was hampered by the lack of standardized reporting incomplete communication between regions, and the sheer speed of the outbreak. Researchers noted the virus's unusual lethality in young adults, its rapid progression, and its capacity to cause secondary bacterial complications. Despite these insights, there was little that could be done to prevent infection, alter its course in severe cases, or protect populations from exposure. Medicine had reached the limits of its contemporary capability, confronted with a pathogen that exceeded existing knowledge, infrastructure, and resources. By the latter half of 1918, it became evident that the influenza was a global medical catastrophe. Hospitals were overflowing across continents. Medical staff were exhausted and ill, and treatment remained largely supportive rather than curative. The virus continued to exploit the vulnerabilities of human systems, from overcrowded cities to inadequately staffed rural clinics. Even where interventions were implemented, the combination of social mobility, asymptomatic carriers, and viral virulence ensured continued transmission. The pandemic had transformed from a local medical challenge into an international crisis, testing the limits of human knowledge, resilience, and organization. This period also illustrates the limits of expectation. Humanity had long assumed that medicine could control disease through care, observation, and intervention. The influenza pandemic demonstrated that these assumptions were contingent upon the nature of the pathogen and the social systems surrounding it. The virus did not respect borders, social hierarchies, or medical expertise. It exploited the intersection of human vulnerability, mobility, and incomplete knowledge, leaving even the most prepared institutions struggling to respond. In doing so, it revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of modern medicine, exposing a profound gap between aspiration and reality. By the end of this phase, it was clear that contemporary medicine was facing a challenge it could not fully overcome. Hospitals, caregivers, and public health authorities were stretched to their limits, providing care where possible but unable to prevent widespread mortality. The influenza had exposed the fragility of human systems, the limitations of medical science, and the vulnerability of populations already weakened by war, scarcity, and social inequality. This chapter of the pandemic underscores the complex interplay between pathogen, medical infrastructure, and human society, illustrating that the deadliest consequences of disease arise not solely from biology, but from the intersection of multiple vulnerabilities. By late 1918, the influenza pandemic had begun to assert itself, not only in Europe and North America, but across every inhabited continent, revealing the stark vulnerability of a world interconnected by war, trade, and migration. The global spread of the virus was accelerated by human mobility at an unprecedented scale. Soldiers returning from the front lines, merchant sailors, laborers, and refugees carried the pathogen to ports and cities thousands of miles from its initial outbreaks. The movement of goods and people, intensified by wartime logistics, acted as the inadvertent transmission network for a disease whose lethality had already been established in urban centers and military camps. What had begun as scattered local outbreaks now took on the dimensions of a global crisis, with the pandemic's reach limited only by the extent of human habitation. Ports and shipping routes became critical nodes in the international transmission of the virus. Major ports in Europe, North America, Asia, and Africa experienced surges of infection as sailors, dock workers, and travelers brought influenza with them across oceans. Ships themselves, crowded and poorly ventilated, became floating incubators, where the disease could propagate unchecked among passengers and crew. Once ashore, infected individuals introduced the virus to densely populated urban centers, where overcrowding and limited medical infrastructure facilitated rapid spread. The patterns of infection followed the pathways of trade and travel, creating a grim network in which every connection between communities became a potential conduit for contagion. The speed of global spread was staggering. By the autumn of 1918, cities as distant as Bombay, Sydney, and Buenos Aires were reporting cases of influenza, often with severe symptoms and rising mortality. In some instances, The disease appeared almost simultaneously in regions separated by thousands of miles, reflecting the efficiency of human mobility in a modernizing world. It was a phenomenon that transcended national borders, social hierarchies, and climatic zones, demonstrating that pathogens could exploit the increasing interconnectedness of human society with devastating effect. The pandemic was no longer a local or regional crisis. It had become a truly global event, one whose impact would reverberate across continents and generations. In Europe, countries still recovering from the destruction of war were ill-prepared to respond to a pathogen of this scale. Medical infrastructure, already stretched thin by the care of wounded soldiers, could not cope with the simultaneous influx of influenza patients. In cities like London, Paris, and Madrid, hospitals overflowed, temporary wards were established in public buildings, and caregivers were exhausted and falling ill themselves. The challenge was compounded by the unpredictability of the virus, which could strike healthy young adults with fatal intensity while leaving other populations relatively unscathed. Public health authorities struggled to coordinate responses across regions, hampered by incomplete data, disrupted communications, and a lingering focus on wartime priorities. North America faced similar challenges. Major cities, including New York, Boston, and Philadelphia, experienced waves of illness that overwhelmed hospitals and disrupted essential services. Urban density facilitated rapid transmission, while factories, offices, and public transportation systems became sites of exposure. Public health messaging struggled to keep pace with the speed of the outbreak, and compliance with recommended measures varied across communities. Even in rural areas, previously isolated populations were not spared. Travelers, returning soldiers, and trade routes ensured that no region remained untouched for long. The virus demonstrated a remarkable capacity to exploit both human mobility and social vulnerability, highlighting the global scale of the crisis. In Asia, the pandemic revealed the vulnerability of densely populated cities and regions with limited medical infrastructure. Ports such as Bombay, Calcutta, Shanghai, and Manila reported rapid outbreaks, often accompanied by severe mortality. Rural areas, while initially less affected, were eventually drawn into the pandemic through trade, migration, and seasonal labor movements. Communities that lacked trained medical personnel, hospital facilities, or even rudimentary sanitation suffered disproportionately. The interplay between social vulnerability, population density, and limited healthcare capacity created conditions in which the virus could exert maximal impact, often overwhelming local resources before external assistance could arrive. Africa and the Pacific Islands, despite geographic isolation, were not spared. Colonial administration, trade networks, and the movement of laborers facilitated the introduction of influenza to populations that had experienced limited exposure to prior influenza strains. Mortality in these regions was often high, exacerbated by malnutrition, inadequate medical facilities, and the absence of effective treatment. In some communities, entire villages experienced waves of illness in rapid succession, leaving survivors to cope with both the physical devastation of disease and the disruption of social structures. The pandemic exposed not only biological vulnerability, but also the inequalities inherent in global systems of power and resource distribution. The social consequences of this global spread were profound. Families confronted the loss of multiple members, communities experienced collective grief, and traditional social structures were strained to the breaking point. Funerary practices, religious rites, and communal gatherings were disrupted as mortality exceeded the capacity of institutions to respond. Schools and workplaces were closed, further compounding the disruption of daily life. Even where social and economic resources were available, the speed and unpredictability of the virus rendered conventional coping mechanisms insufficient. The pandemic reshaped human experience on a global scale, illustrating that the consequences of a disease extend far beyond individual mortality. Medical knowledge and public health interventions varied widely across regions, reflecting disparities in resources, infrastructure, and governance. In some cities, authorities attempted quarantines, school closures, and restrictions on public gatherings. These measures, while partially effective in slowing transmission, were often inconsistently applied and frequently undermined by economic necessity or social fatigue. In rural or resource-limited regions, interventions were minimal or non-existent, leaving populations highly exposed. The virus exploited these inconsistencies, moving from one community to another with remarkable efficiency, demonstrating that pandemics are not only biological phenomena, but also social and political events shaped by human systems. The psychological impact of the pandemic's global spread was equally significant. News of outbreaks in distant regions, often accompanied by rising death tolls, created anxiety, fear, and a sense of helplessness. Communities watched the progress of the disease with a mixture of dread and disbelief, struggling to reconcile daily routines with the reality of a pathogen that could appear suddenly and strike lethally. The invisibility of the virus heightened this psychological burden. It could be carried by asymptomatic individuals, spread silently through populations, and strike unpredictably, undermining the sense of security even among those who attempted to take precautions. Economic consequences were deeply intertwined with the global spread of the disease. Trade, commerce, and transportation were disrupted as workers fell ill or died. Factories closed, and shipping lines were delayed. The combined effects of illness, mortality, and social disruption threatened supply chains, particularly in regions dependent on imported goods or centralized production. Rural economies, reliant on labor mobility, were similarly affected, as influenza incapacitated entire households and communities. The pandemic revealed the interconnectedness of global economies and the vulnerability of these systems to disruption by biological forces. Colonial and geopolitical dynamics further complicated the global picture. Populations under colonial rule were often disproportionately affected due to inadequate medical resources, poor living conditions, and social marginalization. Communication between colonial authorities and metropolitan governments was limited, delaying recognition and response. Indigenous populations, already subjected to economic, social, and political disadvantage, experienced severe mortality and disruption, highlighting how pre-existing vulnerabilities could amplify the impact of a global pathogen. The influenza pandemic thus became both a medical and social phenomenon, reflecting the inequalities and structures of human societies as much as the virulence of the virus itself. By the end of 1918, the global footprint of the pandemic was unmistakable. No continent, no major urban center, and no social class remained untouched. The virus had traveled along the pathways of human movement, exploiting the networks created by trade, war, labor migration, and urbanization. Mortality was uneven but widespread, affecting communities already weakened by deprivation, conflict, or marginalization most severely, while even wealthier or less exposed populations were not immune. The pandemic had transformed from a regional outbreak into a global catastrophe, redefining human vulnerability and demonstrating the limits of contemporary knowledge and infrastructure. This phase illustrates the fundamental dynamics of pandemic spread in an interconnected world. Human mobility, social networks, and disparities in resources interacted with the biological characteristics of the virus to produce a crisis of unparalleled scope. The pathogen was neither confined by geography nor constrained by social hierarchy. It moved efficiently through human systems, exposing both resilience and fragility. Communities responded with improvisation, local interventions, and adaptation. Yet these measures could only slow, not prevent, the relentless advance of the virus. The global spread of the influenza also reshaped human perception of disease. For the first time, populations were confronted with a pathogen that could move across continents with unprecedented speed, striking unpredictably and lethally. Traditional assumptions about immunity, vulnerability, and the limits of infection were challenged. Mortality patterns defied expectation, particularly among young adults, who had previously been considered relatively resilient. The pandemic revealed that human societies, no matter how advanced or interconnected, were not immune to disruption by microscopic forces. By the close of this phase, the pandemic had established itself as a global phenomenon, one that would define the final months of 1918 and shape the early part of 1919. Its reach, severity, and impact transcended national borders, social hierarchies, and geographic isolation, demonstrating the profound consequences of a pathogen operating within a highly connected world. The stage was set for continued waves of infection, each exploiting the same vulnerabilities revealed by the first global spread, and each challenging humanity's ability to respond, adapt, and endure.